proud to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Irwin Goldman. Dr. Goldman is currently professor and chair of the Department of Horticulture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His primary research responsibilities are vegetable crop breeding and genetics, and instruction in plant breeding, vegetable crops, and evolutionary biology. Dr. Goldman received his bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois, his master's of science from North Carolina State University, and his doctoral degree from the University of Wisconsin. He also completed postdoc work at the University of Illinois. Dr. Goldman has been a faculty member at Wisconsin since 1992 and has served in a variety of administrative roles, including Associate Dean for Research, Vice Dean, and Interim Dean. The title of his presentation today is Take 2 Onions and Call Me in the Morning, the Possibility and Pitfalls of Breeding for Health-Related Traits. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Irwin Goldman.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Brian and Laura and the rest of the organizing committee for including me. This is a real honor to be here, and I'd also like to thank our colleagues at DuPont Pioneer for supporting this. It's a real terrific opportunity for me to share a story with you about work we've been doing for a long time. And when I started this work at Wisconsin, I looked like this. I had black hair, and I look like this now on a good day, and that represents a period of about 17 years worth of work on onions. I've enjoyed every single minute of it, but I do want to point out that our president has been at this for only 8 years, and he looks a little bit like this. Now, his job is a little more challenging than mine, but nevertheless, it happens to all of us. And I have to say that as I've worked on this project and been involved in this activity, I have learned so much about the connection between vegetables and health, and I want to share what I've learned about that subject with you today and this morning. As Brian said, I'm involved in plant breeding activities. I breed carrot, onion, and table beet. I'm also very involved in classroom teaching and mentoring students. And I organize one of the nation's only giant pumpkin regattas that takes place in October every year in Madison, where we grow and then paddle giant pumpkins. And someday I'd like to organize an intercollegiate pumpkin regatta and invite the Texas A&M crowd up to join us. So crops have a very ancient history with us that is really connected partly to our health, not just for food, but crops were originally domesticated with medicinal and health purposes in mind. Rice was partly connected to many in folklore to the demons affecting the fertility of newly married couples, and this is why people throw rice at weddings. Tomatoes, before they were domesticated into the shape we know today, were used to treat a number of ailments, including eye diseases. Seeds from vegetables in the Apiaceae, including carrot and parsnip, the seeds now, not the roots, were used to derive all sorts of medicines. And as we'll talk about here this morning, the alliums, onions, garlic, leek, chive, have been used to treat infections and to improve blood circulation for thousands of years. So it's no surprise to find that our crops have health-related connections. Brian cited this famous phrase that is attributed to Hippocrates, let your food be your medicine and your medicine be your food. And in many ways, the work that we're talking about here is no different than what the Greeks were talking about a long time ago. Now, some of you may laugh at this slide, but there is an idea that the onion domes, which are very common features of Eastern architecture, are built at least partly as reverential symbols of the onion and garlic bulbs that were so important to the people of those cultures, that not just for food, but also for health reasons. And so while not every architectural historian will agree with this comparison, we find a deep connection of these vegetables with the culture. And today, so much of what we get in the media is about, the dangers of these foods and what we shouldn't eat, and it changes from week to week. I think it makes it incredibly difficult for the general public to sort out what is valuable and what is not valuable with respect to food and health. And it should be a question that we are prepared to answer. It turns out that those questions are not so simple, and it's partly why we're all here today. The category of food that we might think about in the marketplace is a functional food category. These have some demonstrable health benefit beyond nutrition. So they could be some sort of added fiber or added bacteria to dairy products, for example, that give not just basic nutrition but have some demonstrable health benefit. We might give as an example a carotenoid molecule. A carotenoid molecule has vitamin A function in your body, but it also has perhaps some antioxidant activity which makes the molecule multifunctional and would, according to this definition anyway, render it a functional food. There's lots of problems, in my opinion, with food functionality. I mean, I think probably a lot of our food is functional. We just simply don't know its functions. And in addition, it leaves out the category of dysfunctional foods, which I think have some demonstrable emotional benefit for all of us. I'm just kidding here, folks. But, you know, this is something that when we think about food, it's not just about its components. It's not just about its core health things that we can measure, but there's so many other things that go into food. In Wisconsin, where I live, bait, wine, and beer may be some of the most functional foods that we have. I want to mention this picture, which I think says a lot about the current state of interest in this subject. This is a picture from Mike's Liquor Store on Regent Street in Madison, Wisconsin. I walk past Mike's on my way to work and on my way home every day. Mike has a sign in the window that says, "We have vintage flavonoids." Now, admittedly, Madison is a bit of an academic sort of town, and maybe people know the word flavonoids there, but it points out the fact that the general public is aware of and interested in the constituents in the foods that they eat and drink. And I think this is significant for us because we are the crop experts and people are asking us, what is in this and is it good for me? And so this gets at what we're going to talk about today. Now, onions and garlic, which are ancient crops and members of the Amaryllidaceae family, have been used as food. They've been used as medicine for thousands of years. The Egyptians are famous for not only using the alliums for important spice and important food, but also for health reasons to improve blood circulation. And you have a picture of that from many thousands of years ago on the left of the slide. And very clear descriptions of the people that built the pyramids eating garlic as part of their daily diet. We see the representation of the bulbs in the Eastern architecture, as I mentioned earlier, and we see many ancient herbals, that is, documents, books that describe the connection between plants and health, having extensive discussion of onions and garlic and all the related members of that family. And a document from one of the herbals is there on the right. These herbals often describe very specific preparations for onions and garlic, and often they're topical preparations where the vegetables are squeezed, the juice is put on to prevent an infection or to prevent further infection, sometimes to promote blood circulation. All of this is very, very well documented in these herbals, and in some ways the herbals represent that tight connection between agriculture and human health, or medical botany, or whatever you want to call it, that brings us to the subject that we're talking about today. So very, very close connection even now with these vegetables around the world. It's still common in parts of Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, to put compresses, topical alliums on to promote blood circulation. For some reason in Wales, they are obsessed with alliums, and they wear leeks on their lapels, and they even have leeks on their coinage in Wales. And finally, in India, it is so important, the presence, the existence of onions and garlic is so important to the cuisine that there are public riots when the price or supply of these is not to the public's liking. So we have a still very tight connection between these vegetables and the people that consume them. But you go to the pharmacy, right, and you look there and you don't see a bin of onions when you go to the pharmacy. You see this. And these are highly purified synthetic monomolecular drugs, and this is what we have largely embraced when it comes to matters of health. Now, I'm not going to say that this is bad. In fact, I'll argue that highly purified synthetic monomolecular drugs have been critical to preventing and treating and curing disease, not only in this country but around the world. It is a great thing that we have them. But I think one of the facts about this is that we've sort of moved away from the connection between food and health that our ancestors had, and that many of these remedies come from as we've embraced this particular technology. I think also the just changing demographics of the 20th century have been part of this loss of collective information about the connection between food and health. You know, we have the beautiful sort of farmstead maybe early in the 20th century. We have the encroachment of the urban area by the middle of the 20th century. And then today, you know, we have just dense urban environments where there isn't a connection between the food, where the food is produced, and the people that consume it. And so I think as we've sort of gone through this transition, we've missed these connections and this understanding of the way that the foods were used. I'm just going to give you a little example before we get into the research on alliums. I think the pomegranate is a great case. It also was used by the ancient Egyptians as an important food crop, and it had lots of important symbolism to the Egyptians and to many people in the Middle East. It was glorified in ancient Rome. The painter Botticelli put, this is Madonna with a baby and pomegranate right here. This was painted in 1487. These were incredibly important foods that were connected spiritually to the people. They were connected to their health. And the Pom Wonderful Company has taken that pomegranate and made it into this product that is now on grocery store shelves all around here. I'm sure we can find it not too far from this building. And they're promoting the pomegranate for its health value-added characteristics. And the way they're promoting it is through advertisements like this: cheat death. That is the advertisement for Pom Wonderful. Now, is this an appropriate way to promote this the health value of the pomegranate? Not only do I think this is a bad way to do it, I think it's incredibly misleading, but my opinion doesn't matter so much. I think the Federal Trade Commission matters more, and the FTC filed a complaint saying that the claims of Pom were false and unsubstantiated because they did not have the scientific studies to back up what they were claiming, and they paid a very, very significant fine. The FTC said, where's the evidence for this connection between the pomegranate and health? A reasonable consumer would look at your advertisement saying cheat death, and they would say, you know, that means if I drink 8 ounces of Pom juice every day, it could prevent disease. And they brought up scientists like people in this room during the court case, during the discussion, and there just isn't enough evidence. Now, maybe the pomegranate does have value-added characteristics, but it is probably our responsibility, or at least certainly within our domain, to do the research and to form the partnerships that can test that out. Unfortunately, Pom Wonderful hadn't done that. So sometimes I do wonder if the current marketing scheme for some of our crops and their health values is nothing but just modern version of snake oil sales, right? And so I think we have to dig very deep to find out what the true value of these things are. So you can learn a lot about somebody by what's in their medicine cabinet. And I don't know if you've ever looked in somebody else's medicine cabinet. You don't have to tell me if you have. But I'm going to show you the inside of my medicine cabinet. And I am a big advocate of these vegetables for health-related characteristics. But as I've studied this and learned a lot about it, I have to say that I've also become a skeptic in many ways too. And I want to share that with you. You'll also notice in my medicine cabinet a small bottle of highly purified synthetic monomolecular drugs, which is aspirin. And aspirin, of course, is also originally a natural product. It came from willow. It came from spirea. It came from other plants around the world. And, of course, today is synthesized. But that is another important natural product with health characteristics. I've already mentioned that the Egyptians used alliums for circulation. We know that the first Olympic athletes were fed onions and garlic as a way to promote blood circulation before their events. We know that farmers around the world, including particularly in Europe, have treated blood clots in their animals by feeding them onions and garlic. Clearly, there is some evidence that cultures around the world have collected that these vegetables have some relationship to blood circulation. Our farmers are also interested in the question of whether onion can be considered a functional food. You know, does it have some demonstrable health benefit beyond just the simple nutrition that it carries? And if so, they've said to me, well, can we put that on our bags? Can we label it? What can we say? And that's part of the thing that drew me into this whole conversation a number of years ago. I want to mention two individuals, one of whom, Bimu Patil, is sitting in this room right here, and most of you here at Texas A&M know Bimu Patil. He directs the Vegetable and Fruit Improvement Center. He was a student of Leonard Pike. Leonard Pike was a professor in the department here at Texas A&M. And Leonard, before anybody else, was working on the health value characteristics of onion long time ago. And when I was a student, I heard Leonard talk about this, and I learned about Leonard's work. And so when I ended up getting a job and having an opportunity to work on onions, I wanted to continue some of that work. And so I give him and Bimu a lot of credit for the work that was started here at Texas A&M. I run an onion breeding program. We do classical onion breeding. Here's a picture of our onion breeding nursery in Randolph, Wisconsin on muck soil. This is a grower's field where we're working and we're doing some weeding. To get to the final stage of onion seed, that of a new variety, is an incredibly long process. It can take between 12 and 20 years to breed a new variety of onions. If this is the final seed product that's going to be sold to the farmer, this is a very laborious enterprise like most plant breeding. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with the onion life cycle, in a 30-year career breeding onions, I can do 15 cycles of breeding. It's not very much. Compare that to somebody who's breeding beans or corn or tomatoes who could easily do 90 cycles, right? So it is a really different kind of crop to breed. I will start with a seed in May. I'll get a root in September. I then have to vernalize and store that root from, say, September all the way to April, all the way to almost 2 months from now, which time I'll pull it out of storage, plant it in the ground, and make seed on it the following season. These are true biennials, and it takes 2 years to go through one cycle of breeding. What's unique about the alliums and why do they have these health characteristics? Well, first of all, what you need to know about this is something you probably already know very well, is that they are full of very interesting sulfur compounds. The sulfur in alliums is stored as cysteine sulfoxides or alkenyl cysteine sulfoxides, which is the way that these plants just partition their sulfur when they take sulfate up from the soil. You only notice these sulfur compounds when you break the tissue of the bulb. When you start to chop that garlic or chop that onion, it causes a tissue disruption. And that tissue disruption brings the alliinase enzyme into contact with the cysteine sulfoxides. And you know that's happening because that reaction, that chemical reaction, produces something called thiosulfonates. And the thiosulfonates are what you smell and what you taste when you are eating one of these vegetables. Or when you walk into the kitchen and somebody is cutting and sauteing these things, it's thiosulfonates in the air that you're perceiving. Now, these thiosulfonates are present in the alliums because they confer pest resistance. For any pest that chews on that leaf, they get a blast of these thiosulfonates, and it's one of the ways the plant defends itself. So this is a really wonderful kind of defense because it's a kind of defense that's not on all the time. It's only on once there's predation of the tissues. But it turns out that these thiosulfonates, in addition to giving pest resistance, they give flavor. It's one of the reasons why we crave them and why we want to eat them. They mask other flavors. So historically, when food spoiled before refrigeration, people used them to mask off flavors. And they have a range of very unique health-related properties. So it's kind of a wonderful sort of system to study because it's got a lot going for it. There are a number of ways you could look at the sulfur compounds. The thiosulfonates have an antithrombotic and an antimicrobial activity, which we'll talk about. There are sulfides that have an anti-cancer and anti-diabetic connection. There are also other kinds of compounds in these plants that have health characteristics, the flavonoids, and even the sugars, which are in the form of oligofructose, which have very interesting probiotic activity. So you could make a whole lifetime out of studying the alliums for health characteristics, and we just picked one of those. We were very interested in this circulatory issue that I mentioned earlier. And there's lots of ways that onion and garlic have been shown to affect cardiovascular health. And one of them is there are some papers that suggest they lower blood lipids. There is some evidence of blood pressure lowering and antioxidant activity there. But the one that attracted us most was the antiplatelet or antithrombotic activity. This is the ability of these vegetables to keep blood flowing, to keep blood from clotting. The idea is that you have blood flowing through a coronary artery, and at some stage for all of us, we get plaque in our arteries. It's a natural process. It begins happening as young as age 5. and the plaque accumulates in all of us depending on our diet and exercise and our genes. The platelets are circulating through the coronary arteries, and the platelets are little disc-shaped cells in the blood, very, very important for a number of things, including forming a clot when you get cut, right? So you don't want to bleed too much, the platelets form a clump. But one of the things that happens is that the platelets clump in response to obstructions in the coronary artery. So when the plaque, the walls of these plaques are very thin. When they rupture, chunks of plaque break off and the platelets begin to aggregate around them. And it is those platelet aggregates that are really the main cause of heart attack and stroke. So often what's happening is that a clump of platelets is occluding the coronary artery. And that is a key, that leads to heart attack, right? So what a cardiologist would like to do is not eliminate that, because you need your platelets to clump, but rather turn that whole situation down a notch or two so that they don't clump as readily. And the way that most do that is through aspirin. A lot of people take aspirin, a baby aspirin a day, or one aspirin a day, or a half an aspirin a day, to slow their platelets down. In fact, it will acetylate the platelet and keep it from aggregating entirely. And this is one of the ways that people deal with cardiovascular health. So we were curious to know if you could get this effect from onion, and if so, what would that be like? How would that work? So that's what we began to study. We learned, though, quickly from our most important source, the onion, that it's not just the heart attack itself, it's that aspirin taken daily with a bottle of bourbon reduces the awareness of heart attacks. So this is a very important finding that I hope you'll all explore in a little more detail. Now, I as a horticulturist and a plant scientist, like many of you in this room, the training that we had nothing to do with hematology. I was at a land-grant university like this, where there was access to people who study this stuff. And I think it's one of the greatest arguments for the kind of places that we're all working at. We have a collection of scientists. I found a guy who was a hematologist oncologist who was willing to talk to me about onions, and he taught me about how they measure blood platelets. And without that, I wouldn't have been able to do this work. So hematologists use these devices, and this is one of the devices they use. It's called a platelet aggregometer. You suspend wires into a cuvette with blood. You then introduce into the cuvette the substances that your body normally uses to clump platelets, like ADP or collagen or thrombin. The platelets clump around the wires. It changes the resistance across the wires, and you can measure that. It's a way that they measure whether your platelets are working. So you could take this cuvette and you could add in there some dark beer, or you could add in red wine, or you could add in onion juice, and it will change the resistance across those wires, and you can use that as a device to sort of get a sense for how much the onion or the garlic will inhibit the platelets from aggregating. So we began to use the platelet aggregometer, and here's actually a picture. That's actually me, where somebody is drawing my blood to use for these studies. And at the beginning, I and my graduate students were the donors of the platelets for this research. And then I realized Madison has like 42,000 undergraduate students, who we could bleed potentially, right? So we began, we gave out gift certificates for ice cream, we gave out all sorts of things, and we actually figured out how to do blood donations, and then we had to go through all the biosafety to get our horticulture lab approved for doing blood donations and human subjects research. All of that was new to me, and I think that's a part of the equation that we're going to probably hear about today, is that we do need to work in an interdisciplinary fashion and learn some new things. One of the very first things we learned about the work was that depending on how you prepared the tissue, depending on how you cooked with the tissue, you would get different chemistry. And this was very startling for me. In the yellow box is the whole tissue. In this case, this is garlic. In the green box is the crushed tissue, like if you put it through a garlic press. And in the white box is how you cook it. So on the left of the white box, we have just garlic and water. And then in the middle, we have garlic with steam. And on the far right, we have garlic cooked in oil. And you get different chemistry depending on whether it's cooked in steam or cooked in oil, or whether it's just put in water. The whole tissue, you have the cysteine sulfoxide itself. Then the alliinase enzyme comes into contact with it, and it makes the thiosulfonates, which are in the green box, and then it just goes to everything. So you cannot pinpoint the efficacy of garlic itself unless you talk about the culinary preparation, unless you talk about how you make it and what food it's with. And I think this is a very interesting point, that culturally speaking, the way different cultures around the world eat the vegetables may have something to do with their health bioactivities, because the chemistry is different. It turns out that steam distillates have a very interesting effect on particular kinds of cells, like certain kinds of cancer cells, whereas oil products with these vegetables have a very specific effect on platelets. So it's a complex situation. One of the early things that we did was we looked at segregating materials in our plant breeding program for their ability to have this medicinal effect. And what we found right away was that these traits, these medicinal traits, were highly correlated with pungency and soluble solids. So the more pungent the onion was, the more medicinal activity it had. The higher level of soluble solids it had, the less water it had, the more medicinal activity it had. This is not surprising, right? This is kind of what we would expect for this sort of work, that the more sulfur-based compounds it has, the hotter it is, the more medicinal activity it would have. We then had this brilliant idea, or at least I thought I had a brilliant idea. Okay, if it's all due to sulfur, let's grow onions in incredibly high sulfur soils. Let's pack the sulfur in the soil, produce a very high sulfur onion, and we'll get a medicinally enhanced product. And like many of my ideas, this was a total failure. It was an enormous failure. We grew onions starting at 2 millimolar sulfate, which already is a high level of sulfur. We then upped it to 7 millimolar and 12 millimolar sulfate, which is like about as high as you can possibly make it. And it had absolutely no significant effect at all on the onion-induced antiplatelet activity, or OIAA. Instead, what we created was the world's most sulfur-enriched roots that have ever been seen on the planet. We basically put sulfur in the roots, and the plant has its own sort of mechanisms to transport that sulfur into the bulb, and of course it did not transport it. It just stayed in the root tissue. So the plants you can't pack them with that much sulfur. You can certainly get some sulfur in there. One of the most surprising things that we found early on was that when you store onions, and all farmers in the Midwest where we grow, and certainly in Canada, in the northern part of the country, they actually store their onions for months after harvest. And they sell them as the market gets good in the winter and in the early spring. And from 0 to 90 days post-harvest, all of the onions actually increase in their medicinal activity. So all of those downward sloping lines that you see on the graph on the right are actually increases in the medicinal activity. This trait, because it's antiplatelet activity or onion-induced antiplatelet activity, the downward sloping lines suggest increasing medicinal activity. And some of them up to 160 days. The older onions actually have more medicinal activity. Part of this is due to the fact that the onion bulb is breaking its dormancy during storage, and some of the chemical machinery is kicking in and beginning to produce more sulfur compounds. But this is a very interesting finding because it suggests that the older onions, the ones that have been stored longer, may have more medicinal value. I mentioned to you earlier that this is a biennial plant. What you're looking at here is the second season of growth. This is the flowering stalk, and we're going to have seeds produced on here. We walk through our seed nurseries. Here's a picture of a seed nursery. And I remember taking some flowers off of this plant and putting them in my mouth. And they were just off the charts pungent, incredibly hot. I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe we could look at the medicinal activity of the flowers. And sure enough, the flowers are way stronger than the bulbs. And this makes complete sense to me now, understanding the entire chemical ecology of this plant, because the bulb is a storage resting place for the sulfur compounds. When that bulb breaks dormancy and sends up a flowering stalk, those sulfur compounds actually get shunted from the outer scales to the inner scales of the bulb, and then they get shunted up the flowering stalk to the flowers. Jane Lancaster in New Zealand had done work on this in the 80s, showing that the hotter parts of the onion bulb are actually the inner core, especially as that bulb ages, because the sulfur compounds move from the old leaves to the new leaves, and then they get shunted up to the top. So we did a whole bunch of studies on this. Actually, during the second year of growth, the bulb has no medicinal value whatsoever. all the sulfur compound moves up the scape into the flowers. And both the flowers and the seeds that are produced in those flowers have very strong medicinal activity, which is really an interesting thing about how, what are these compounds doing in the plant anyway, and how does all of that fit together? So, one of the basic lessons about food and health, of course, is you are what you eat. And this is something that we're all told when we're little. But the truth turns out to be that you are what you don't excrete, right? Because you can eat anything, but if you don't retain it, if it doesn't stay in your system, if it just simply gets excreted, the chances of it having some health bioactivity for you are very small. And this is the very sad part of my presentation, because what we found when we were actually looking at how these vegetables are consumed by people, that 1 minute of cooking, actually even 30 seconds of cooking, eliminates all of the ability of that onion juice to inhibit platelet activity. So you see that black line approaching the red line, which is the control. It's absolutely no value after 30 seconds of cooking. And this makes complete sense if you think about it. This is an enzyme-mediated process that's producing thiosulfonates. The enzyme is killed by the heat. The thiosulfonates themselves are volatile. They're moving up into the air, and you all know that because they're in the kitchen when you go and you experience them when people are cooking with them. So this was very depressing in a way to say, okay, cooking the way we would normally eat these onions, it completely wrecks it. And not only that, but around that time, some groups around the world were studying this, and they found that in rat studies and in other studies of feeding animals, that the boiled juice of onions, or in this case, the boiled juice of the Allium fistulosum, the green onions, not only had no medicinal effect, but in some cases, the actual cooked product promoted platelets to aggregate, actually stimulated the platelets to aggregate, which is exactly the opposite of what you want. And we've since done all sorts of work around that topic. This is a piece of data from Emily Hansen, who studied this in our lab recently. And if you look at this graph, you'll see that 1 minute of cooking is still, you're losing some of the activity. In this case, 3 minutes of cooking, you lose most of the activity in this study. And by 6 minutes of cooking, you're now on the other side. You're now promoting the platelets to aggregate. And by 15 minutes of cooking, they're really stimulated. So stimulating platelet aggregation is not something considered to be good for health. We really don't know what eating cooked onions will do in a clinical sense, and this is one of the things that we'd love to know. So if you sit down and you eat a plate of onion rings, are you stimulating your platelets to aggregate in this way? But this was a sort of depressing finding. And it leads to what we call the pungency paradox, because the more pungent the onion is, the more efficacious it is for your health. But the more pungent it is, the more difficult it is to eat raw. Now you here in Texas, you have the 1015 onion, you have all these sweet onions that were developed by Leonard Pike and his colleagues. Those onions, you could eat them raw, right? But those onions have less medicinal activity. However, if the strong pungent onions have it, but you can't access it because you got to cook with it, really the best onion is the one that has the least medicinal activity, simply because you can eat it raw, right? So a sweet, mild onion from Georgia, from Texas, even maybe coming up from Mexico, these onions, even though they don't carry as much medicinal activity, simply by the fact that you can consume them uncooked could deliver the potential for the health value. Now, Seminus and Monsanto have released, this is the work of Scott Hendricks, the onion breeder there, an onion called Evermild. Evermild is an onion that is a long day onion, a storage onion. Normally, all of our onions are very, very pungent. This is an onion with very, very low pungency that can be grown in the northern part of the world. And the idea behind this is to give northern consumers an opportunity to eat an onion that is very, very mild, and you don't necessarily have to cook it. This is the kind of thing that you could get a benefit with. I myself in my onion breeding program began crossing with mild types, even the intermediate day onions that grow in New Mexico. This is Chris Kramer, and some of the New Mexico onions that don't mature quite properly in my environment, but they're very mild. And so I was trying to get to mildness by crossing with some of this material, and this is an ongoing activity in my program now to try to bring in more mild genes for mildness as a way to deliver a milder onion to the consumer. People always ask about this work. They say, okay, if aspirin is the treatment that people use, how potent are the sulfur compounds from the alliums? They're way more potent than aspirin. On this graph on the far right is a thiosulfonate called allicin. It's one of the primary thiosulfonates from garlic. It is the primary thiosulfonate. And the lower the bar, the more pungent or the more efficacious it is medicinally. And you can see, compared to aspirin, it is incredibly, incredibly powerful. But one of the things about this that we learned, and we actually synthesize the individual compounds themselves in the lab, is that the thiosulfonates, if just given directly to people, don't work. You cannot give somebody a thiosulfonate and get the medicinal benefit. They're too volatile. You can, however, give them the whole juice, the juice of a raw onion or the juice of raw garlic, and that is very efficacious. Problem is that in addition to being antiplatelet, it's also antisocial. So it's something you have to think about. We began studying this in animal models. One of the most common animal models for studying coronary thrombosis is the canine model, and it was developed by John Foltz. We actually partnered with John Foltz, and we did this work. This is a coronary artery of a dog where there's a flow probe meter put around the coronary artery. And then you can introduce foods, you can introduce liquids, and you can measure the platelet flow through the coronary artery. It's a very common model that's used in medical science. It's also used in the food industry. And the data were extremely encouraging for the use of onion. This is some data. You have the EKG at the top, the blood pressure in the middle, and then the cyclic blood flows on the bottom. And those cyclic blood flows are platelet aggregates forming and then breaking away from us shaking them. And then platelet aggregate forms and we shake it. When you introduce the onion juice, you notice the just beautiful flat line here as this is moving quickly and blood is flowing through the coronary artery. And these also inhibited incredibly strongly intragastrically, so both intravenously and intragastrically, much stronger than many of the medicines that are used for this. So clearly these vegetables have this benefit. In fact, some of the farmers that we work with even went to the lengths of making little tags for their onions. This is one of them. You probably can't read it, but it says studies done at the University of Wisconsin show that eating onions may help maintain cardiovascular health. So this is one of the ways the farmers wanted to say that this stuff actually can work. We did a lot of additional molecular work that I'm not going to talk about in detail today, but some of our QTL work showed that there was a key linkage group on chromosome, the linkage group E, that was responsible for, it had a very strong effect on the medicinal traits and on pungency. And it is a linkage group that I think is very important for the future work here because it shows a cluster of genes that are responsible for the production of these sulfur compounds. In that paper, we say the strong genetic correlations revealed by this study is probably suggesting linkage of the genes that control these traits. And it's really interesting that maybe the ever-mild onion biseminous and probably a new patent by Nunums, which is owned by Bayer Crop Science, this is the work of Rick Watson, which the patent was issued in 2014, covers 4 new inbred lines that are low pungency, long storage onions, probably due to breaking the genetic linkage between storage and solids and pungency and the medicinal traits. So these kind of onions, which have been developed in industry, are probably going to be one of the ways to deliver some of the health value-added characteristics to consumers. A couple of interesting facts as we conclude here. There have been some recent attempts to modify onions to make them easier to consume. You know, the propane thiol sulfoxide, which is the thing that makes you cry, has been knocked out with RNAi by Colin Eadie in New Zealand. This is never going to be a commercial product because New Zealand has canceled this program. But recently, the House Foods Group in Japan did a series of projects to eliminate the lacrimatory factor synthase gene, and they have produced a tearless onion which will go to market this year. This is going to be a very interesting thing for the world to have the first tearless onion, and you can ask yourself what you think about this. This does not eliminate the sulfur compounds, but it eliminates some of the unpleasant sulfur interactions as you're cutting and eating an onion. By the way, the discovery by the Japanese group, which was made in 2002, of this enzyme called lacrimatory factor synthase, which is a really amazing finding showing this enzyme that produces the compound that makes you cry won an Ig Nobel Award. And I don't know how many of you follow the Ig Nobel Awards, but this is a really kind of a fun story. So also, the tearless onions do have thiosulfonate profiles that are still look very healthy, and they look actually quite similar to garlic. So the bottom line on this is that the tearless onions look a little bit more like garlic from a chemical point of view, but probably should deliver some interesting health benefits. You know, just from a point of view of perspective, in 1991, as the story about the French paradox broke on 60 Minutes. This is the story, by the way, that the French eat a lot of saturated fat in their diet, but have a lower incidence of heart disease than people in the United States. The explanation given in that story was that the French drink a lot of red wine, and red wine has flavonoids in it and inhibit platelets from platelets don't aggregate as readily, and so the French just have a healthier diet. What happened in the United States in response to this story immediately was that somebody produced a product, a nutritional supplement called French Paradox. And I think this reflects a kind of way that we think about food and health. We say there's something good in this vegetable, there's something good in this fruit, let's literally make a pill and have people take it. It is a much more complicated situation than that. People have since studied the nutritional supplements produced from onion and garlic. Many of them have absolutely no activity whatsoever, because they are deodorized or they are cooked beyond recognition as they are made into pills. And so the situation is very complex. Onions and garlic have a huge, long, deep history and connection with culture. Clearly, there are medicinal properties, but the real story about how we're going to deliver those medicinal properties is much more complicated. And I guess I would say that there are health benefits. Clearly, there are health benefits to the raw product that are well documented, but the way we cook, the way we process, the way we actually consume these vegetables raises additional questions. Breeding is clearly playing a role to develop some cultivars that may make the compounds more palatable and bring them into the diet in new ways, but clinically relevant studies have to be conducted in order to fully assess their health value, and that's one of the areas that my lab is hoping to participate. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goldman, for that presentation. We now have time for about 10 minutes of a question and answer session. We are streaming live via webinar, so if you have a question in our live audience today, please raise your hands. We have two microphone assistants, David Horn and Nolan Bentley. Raise your hands. They'll come over to you with the microphone so that everybody can hear you. For our webinar listeners, your questions are also important to us. Type your questions now into the GoToWebinar chat box, and we have a moderator looking at those. We'll make sure that we get your questions read as well. Who's first? Matthew Mattia, our first question asker.
Hi, really wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it. I was just wondering if you've looked at any kind of dosage effect. So are you drinking a gallon of onion juice? I mean, it's really unpleasant. Or have you looked at any kind of absorption? So how your body absorbs it and metabolism maybe.
Great questions. Thank you, Matt. So two questions, a dosage effect and sort of metabolism of these. We've looked at both of those things. On the dosage side, if you look at just the juice from one medium-sized raw onion is enough to inhibit human platelets for hours. We've done some of these experiments on ourselves, actually, by coming into the lab and fasting from dinner, coming in the lab in the morning and eating 150 grams of raw onion or drinking raw onion juice. Now, that is not a pleasant experience, especially with these pungent onions. So it does work with that amount. It's consumable, but it is probably not feasible for people unless they're incredibly enthusiastic about onions to do that. In terms of metabolism, yeah, it's a fascinating thing. The milieu of the raw juice works incredibly well, but the more, and actually the thiosulfonates are transformed into other compounds in the body, but they still have a very strong effect by somehow binding to the platelets. But anything less than that, just the individual thiosulfonates respire immediately, and you can detect it in the room. They just are in the air. So there's something about the milieu or that whatever that is that preserves those compounds and makes them efficacious. Great question.
We have a question over by Nolan.
Does the color of onion influence the health benefits?
That's a very important question. Does the color affect the health benefits? The answer is generally no. The dark colors, the dark reds and the dark browns have more flavonoids in them. However, most of those flavonoids are concentrated in the outer skins. So to the extent that it has more flavonoids, I guess I could say yes. But on the sulfur compound side, there's no effect of color. And really, we do see differences among the colored onions, but it's only because of the genetic background that they're in or the cultivar that they're in. It's not because of the color per se. So if color does have a health value, it's connected to the flavonoids, which is really a separate situation than what I was talking about today.
Let's take a question from Nolan's side of the room. Dr. Smith, do you have a question?
Thanks, Dr. Goldman. Appreciate you being here today. Would you share with the students a little bit about the size of your breeding program, the number of progeny you can evaluate, and the number of locations, and a few of those kinds of details?
Certainly. So we breed 3 different crops. We have 7 locations that we test in around the state of Wisconsin. We make thousands of crosses a year, but not with onion. With onion, we might make 200 or 250 crosses a year because it's extremely difficult, first of all, to have individual cages make the crosses and to look at the progeny. In beets, I probably make 12 to 1,500 crosses a year, and in carrots, probably 500 to 700 crosses a year. I have a group of 10 people in my program. We spend a lot of time in the field in the summer, but for us in vegetable breeding, looking at only a couple thousand crosses and 5,000 or so plots is a lot of work. That's about as much as we can handle in the vegetables. All of it's hand harvested, by the way. None of that can be done with machine.
Sam?
Yes, you mentioned about the seed stalks and sulfur compounds getting translocated up into the flowers. And so I was wondering your thoughts on eating the flower head compared to the quantity of raw onion juice, and if you thought one would have more effect than the other.
Yes, I'm with you on that. And in fact, you can find places in the world that make the flowers a salad, put them in salad. You can even find that in California. There are some people that sell them. I think actually that's a better delivery system because you could mix it in with a salad and you can just taste it, but it's not overpowering. And yet it does deliver very, very, because they're so potent, you do get the medicinal benefits. So I think something like that is going to be better than the juice, which a lot of people can't tolerate for gastrointestinal reasons.
Yeah, thank you for a very, very good presentation. And I come from India, and India and Middle East are the largest consumer of onions. But most of it, I will say 95% of it used to make curry for meat or for vegetables and so on. And the curry is made in a way, it's almost like for 1 kilo meat, you use half a kilo onion. But you caramelize it in oil before you put the spices and the meat. And based on your presentations, unless it is eaten raw, now the same family will cut 1 onion for salad, and they will share a little piece here and there. So if 5% only is consumed as raw in that part of the world, what would breeding bring to these people unless we breed for onion that maintains some of its good properties even when it is being caramelized? Thank you.
Yes, great point. So our data would suggest that the longer they're cooked, and certainly to caramelize or to brown them and get the Maillard products, you won't get this particular medicinal benefit. You would only get it through something that's raw or cooked very little. And so I think we are maybe missing an opportunity there. On the other hand, if we breed onions that are palatable in the raw form, maybe people will increase their consumption of that. And I think the sweet onions is one way to do that. But Long cooking, probably not, for this particular medicinal benefit.
Let's see a question from Dr. Hoffman.
I got two questions. The first one is, do you use insects on your crossing block? And the second one is, when you eat raw onions in a salad, and the salad has some sort of oil that disturbs the absorption of the compound. Thank you.
Okay, first question, do we use insects in our crossing block? Yes, we use flies for pollination, and all the small, I think that's what you're talking about for pollination. We buy flies from two commercial suppliers in the West, and they do the pollinations for us in the small cages. When we have large cages, we use bees, which do a better job pollinating. But the flies, especially the blue bottle flies, are very strong and do a good job. No, the oil actually, the sulfur compounds are soluble in water, but they're also soluble in oil. So oil by itself as a delivery system is not a problem, and you can still get health benefits with these compounds in oil. It's just that when it's heated, you'll lose it.
We're going to take a question from one of our webinar participants now, from Janine Perdun. You discussed the need for interdisciplinary work. Do you see any future in working with anthropologists to gain an understanding about different cultural uses and preparation of onion and correlations of the health status of the members of those cultures?
That is such an excellent question. And yes, I mean, I feel like if we had an opportunity to bring in social scientists, it would enhance our work. And probably that's a comment that appears on a lot of the grant reviews that I get back that don't get funded. But in fact, really, what we've learned is that the culinary preparation is very significant for the delivery of this system. And so we probably would benefit hugely from those associations.
There's concern with certain crops about drug interactions. Grapefruit comes to mind.
Yes.
Has anyone investigated the potential for drug interaction? I ask this also because of family members that are on blood thinners
Yes.
and eating onions.
Such a great question. So indeed, there is, and there is in the surgical literature very clear warnings for people to stay away from garlic before surgery because they bleed too much. And if you're on blood thinners or if you're taking a lot of aspirin and you do have a lot of garlic or onion, certain people will bleed too much, and doctors will tell you that. We also know that domestic animals can die from it because they'll eat too much in the way of onions, especially the cull onions that are put back out on the field. So this is a very significant point that it is so potent, this effect is so potent that it can have negative consequences. Yeah, that's right.
Presentation.
Thank you.
As you mentioned about the sulfur compounds, and are we negating the effect of different flavonoids and other bioactive compounds in onion, which we never even probably explored so far? We know only flavonoids and some of these sulfur compounds, but some of them are still unknown. Do you think when we try to develop a specific variety to reduce the mildness, I mean, to increase the mildness, that's probably great, but I think with the quercetin content in onion has been very high, and particularly in the long storage onions, are we kind of taking out that picture of that and the health benefits, because they have shown some clinical evidences the quercetin has some very strong benefits.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think Bimo's right. And I don't know if everybody heard his comment, but the flavonoids that are in onions, especially in the darker skinned material, particularly quercetin, has been shown to have some very potent medicinal properties. And I think you're right. I mean, I have not focused on that part in my own work, but I think that it's a part that needs attention, and it is very possible that by increasing flavonoid content as well as making the sulfur more palatable, we do much better than one by themselves. So I think I appreciate you bringing it up. You're absolutely right.
Any more questions for Dr. Goldman? Well, if you would like to ask a question, all right, Stephen has one. This will be our last question.
Regarding the temperature denaturing of the enzyme that takes away the medicinal value, is the process of making like powdered products or the granular products at a low enough temperature that the medicinal value is still there for like spice use rather than direct consumption?
For the most part, no. For the most part, the dehydrated products have no medicinal activity whatsoever. They have some flavor left, but the dehydrating process often will just, they're no longer efficacious. The only way to dry them and still get efficacy would be freeze-dried. If you did freeze-drying, you'd still retain it, but not in the normal way they dehydrate onions. Yeah, that would be a great way to get it if you could.
All right, thank you very much for all of your questions, and let's thank Dr. Goldman one more time for his presentation.